Hey guys, and welcome to another one of my tutorials. So in this video, I'll be showing you how to set up Deadzone aiming. So if you don't know what that is, I'll just show you real quick. So basically, the way it works is if you look around with the cursor, as long as you're looking in the middle of the screen, the gun will rotate to face that direction. But if you look too far to the side, then the camera will actually start to rotate. So that works on the right and the left, and also up and down. And then of course, wherever you shoot, the projectile will go to wherever the cursor is. And so I've seen this used for like VR games before. I think it's helps with nausea in that case, but I've also seen it in non-VR games as well. So it's just something that I've seen some people request, and it wasn't something that I saw on YouTube, at least any really good implementations of it. So I figured I'd just try to show you guys how to set it up. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into it. So I'm going to be doing this from scratch. So I'm going to open up the Epic Game Launcher, and I'm on 4.26.1. So I'm gonna go ahead and launch that. I always recommend being on the version that I'm on or newer, just to avoid any issues. But I think for this tutorial, if you're on an older version, it shouldn't really matter because we're not doing anything too crazy. And then we're gonna be starting with the first person template. So once this launches here, we wanna select games at the bottom and then hit next, and then first person and hit next. And then make sure you have blueprint selected. We don't actually need any starter content, so we can say no starter content. And then we can call this whatever we want to call it. So I'm just going to call it Deadzone tutorial, and then hit create project. And then while that's running, I'm going to move this over here just so I can reference it, and then give that a second to launch up here. Okay, so we need to do a couple things real quick before we start actually working on the Deadzone code. One of these things we need to do, if you click on the first person character and you go to his blueprint, we need to kind of clean a few things up in here first. So if you go to the viewport tab, we want to make some modifications here. So since I'm not doing this in VR, I'm going to delete everything below the first person camera, just like this. So I'm going to select it all and then hit delete. And then we'll be adding back the gun here in a second. And it's going to give us a lot of errors. Don't worry about those right now. But before we go, when we add in the new gun, we want to actually modify it, because I'll show you why. If we go back here and we go to first person and we find our gun mesh, which is this guy. If you open this up and you look at it, it's actually facing along the y-axis. So if you look down here at the bottom right or the bottom left, you can see the y-axis is going this way. And that's the way the gun's facing, and it makes things a lot easier. Like, it makes the math a lot easier if the gun is facing along the x-axis, since Unreal treats the x-axis as forward. So we want to actually rotate this gun before we start using it, and that'll just make our lives way simpler. So to do that, the easiest way that I know to do that, to like permanently rotate a mesh, is to export it and then re-import it and then give it a rotation when you import it. So I know it sounds a little crazy, but basically all you do is you right click and you say asset actions, and then you say export. And then you can select location. I believe by default it sends it to the content folder, which is fine. So we'll just call this skfp gun new. And I will say one thing, if you are using your own gun, then the only thing you need to make sure of is that the gun is facing along the x-axis. If your gun already is facing along the x-axis, then don't bother with this if you're using a different gun. But if you're using the first-person gun, then you definitely want to do this. So we can go ahead and hit save, and that will bring up this file, and then just hit export here, and that will export it as an FBX file. And if you go to your content folder, so I'm just going to right click on this and say show in Explorer, and that will pop up this window. And then we go back to the content folder. You can see we have our SKFP gun new. So that's just this model exported. So we want to re-import it, and we want to give it a new rotation. So drag it down here into the mesh folder, and then we want to specify right here under import rotation -90, and that'll rotate it so it's facing along the x-axis. And then we can say import all, and then we want to come back here. So you can see it did a few things that we don't actually want it to do. So we can actually delete the physics asset because we already have one, and we can delete this material it created because we already have one as well. And so then we want to right click on this guy, or sorry, double click on this guy, and we want to assign the physics material in the mesh, and then we'll be done. So for the material, we want to come over here and we want to search for m underscore, I forget what it's called, FP gun, yes. So FP gun, so now it has the material again. And then we want to assign the physics asset. So if you search for physics asset, we can hit this and select our SK FP gun physics asset. And this is just the old one it was using before. So now everything's back to normal, except you'll notice if you look down there at the bottom left, the gun is now facing along the x-axis, which again, we're doing this just to make sure that our math is like a lot easier when we go to write the code. And also, again, if you have your own gun, just make sure when you open it up in this viewer like this, that it's facing along the x-axis, and everything will work fine. Okay, so now that we have that done, we can go back to our first person character, and we want to re-add our gun to it. So if we hit, click on your capsule component, so that way it's going to add it to this component, and then hit add component up here and search for skeletal mesh, and hit skeletal mesh. And the reasons mine's showing this SK gun new here is because I have it currently selected. That's just a feature. So if I unselect it and then I come back here and I say add component again, and I search for skeletal mesh, then it won't show up that way. I just wanted to clarify that in case somebody else was having that problem. So click skeletal mesh, and then make sure it adds like this. Make sure it adds under the capsule component. And then for the skeletal mesh, select the FP gun new. Make sure you select the new one, or whichever one is the one that's facing along the correct axis. And so you can see when we do that, it's facing the correct way. And then you basically can put it wherever you want. I'm just going to raise it up by like 40 on the Z and just have it in the center of the screen like I did in my other video. And yeah, so we still have some compiler errors, and that's why when you compile it, the thing goes away. So we need to just fix these real quick. So if you hit compile and you come down here to the compile results, you can just kind of click on this top one here. And we just want to fix these. And again, I'm not using any sort of motion controller, so I'm not going to worry about that. So I'm just going to delete this bottom part and delete this and delete this. And then we can actually, this is just where it fires a projectile. We actually don't need any of this stuff because this is just figuring out where to fire the projectile from, and we're going to change that anyways. So we can delete this as well. So basically your spawn projectile will kind of look like this. We also don't need this montage to play because we deleted the hands. And the reason we deleted the hands is because it makes things way more complicated to rotate the hands because they're not actually set up to rotate for Deadzone aiming. So I just went ahead and deleted them. If you want to try to add back in some hands later to your model and kind of attach them to the gun, you can do that, but you're going to have to use custom stuff with that, and it's really complicated, and I didn't want to get into the animation side of things in this tutorial because it would have taken forever, and I don't really know how to even do it. So we don't want to do this montage, so we can delete this as well. And so we should be left with something that looks like this, and so we can kind of drag this over here a little bit, and we can hook this up. And then it's still going to be mad at us because it wants to know where we want to spawn the projectile from. And to do that, we're just going to use a socket. They were using like a sphere before, which I have no idea why they did that, but it's kind of stupid. So we're going to just click skeletal mesh over here and add a little socket to it for where we want the bullets to spawn from. And so we can browse to it and then open this guy up. And then for the skeletal tree here, we want to select ammo because that's at the front. And then we want to right click on this and say add socket. And so this is the socket where projectiles are going to spawn from. So we're going to right click on this and say projectile socket. And then we want to move it. So if you press spacebar, it will switch to the moving gizmo thing. And we just want to drag it out in front so that it's not totally inside the barrel. So something like this. And then we can come back here to our first person character now that we have that, and we can say, okay, this is where we're spawning the first person projectile. So we want to spawn it at that socket location. So we can drag in our skeletal mesh, which again is our gun, and we can right click and say get socket transform. And we can hook that into the spawn transform like so. And that should be good. File save. Okay, so that fixed that error. And then we just have a couple more here. They should be pretty easy. So let's click on this next one. So this brings us up to begin play, and it's just complaining because I was doing some hiding for VR stuff. But again, we're not doing anything that with VR, so we can just delete everything here, except don't actually delete the begin play itself. So I'm going to hold down Control and left click to unselect that, and then hit delete, because we are going to want to do stuff in the begin play, but we don't actually need any of that. And then we can compile, and we just have one more error. In the construction script, we don't need this because, again, this was just doing stuff with VR mostly. And so we can delete that. And there we go. So now if we go back to our viewport tab, we should see our gun in the correct spot, rotated correctly, and we shouldn't have any errors when we try to compile. And so now if we press play, you can see our game kind of looks like this. It looks really weird right now because the gun doesn't actually move, but it should look like this. And if it doesn't, then just go back and make sure that you've followed along correctly up to this point. Okay, so that is I think that's pretty much all the things we need to do that aren't really directly related to the Deadzone aiming, but just enough to get it set up. So now that we have that out of the way, I believe, I'm just double checking my other project. I believe we can go ahead and start working on the code for the Deadzone aiming. So the first thing we want to do is we want to set up a new cursor, because if you press play, you can see we just have this red cursor and it's really just always in the middle of the screen. And so that's not going to work, right? Because we want to actually be able to move it around. So we're actually just going to get rid of this cursor. So if you go to the project settings and maps and modes, and then you hit this little drop down here for the selected game modes, we want to get rid of the HUD class because that's the thing that's drawing that little red cursor, and we don't want that. So we just want to select none here, and that will get rid of it. So if we play it, you can see we no longer have that red cursor. But we obviously do want to have some sort of cursor. So we're going to create a widget that will draw a cursor for us. And then since it's in our own custom widget, we can kind of control how the widget works to better fit this Deadzone aiming. So let's come back here to our content folder and right click and say user interface, and then select widget blueprint. And we will call this our cursor underscore widget. And let's just open this guy up here real quick. So this is going to be a really simple widget. Obviously, if you guys have some other sort of cursor image you want to use, then by all means, feel free to use whatever one you want. I think to my other project, I used a cursor from another project, but just to keep things simple so you guys don't have to worry about anything, we're just going to use a very simple image, maybe just a square. And like I said, you can switch out this image to be whatever image you want for your cursor. So the first thing we want to do here is we want to delete this canvas panel because we don't need it. And then we want to search for image up here. And I'm just going to drag this down here. And so this is going to be our image that we want to use. And then we want to come up here to the right and select desired. So doing this doesn't actually change anything about how the game looks. It just changes how this is previewed. So we're basically saying, let me preview this widget at its desired size, right? And so the reason it shrunk it is because if you click on the image over here and you hit brush, you can see the image size is 32 by 32. So if we were to change this to like 64 by 64, you can see it changes the size of it over here because we have it set to desired, which is just a nice way to work, I think. But for right now, let's set this down to like something by 8 by 8 because we're basically just going to use this little dot as our cursor. And then you guys can obviously change this later, and you can select whatever image you want here. If you have a reticle or a cursor image, you can just select it here, and then you can make this bigger or smaller and set it up however you want. But again, not the point of this tutorial, so we're just going to leave it. We're just going to leave it like this. And I think that's the only thing we really need to do here, at least on this page. So let's go over to the designer tab because there is something we're actually going to want to do here. So in the event graph, we can simply just delete all of this stuff. And we just want to add one event here, which is going to allow us to set the cursor position later in the code. And we're just going to write it now because we're already here and it's only going to take a second. So just right click and say add custom event. And we're going to call this set position in viewport centered. And the reason I'm calling it centered is because it's going to specifically set the location of this thing so that it's centered to wherever the mouse is. And so what we want to do here is we want to drag in our image, and actually maybe we should rename this. Yeah, let's go back to the designer tab real quick. And just to make things clear, let's just right click and say rename, and we'll call this our cursor image since that's what it represents. Compile, go back, and then let's drag this in. And we want to ultimately set the position. So we're going to right click and say set position in viewport. And make sure you select this one, not the centered one that we just created. So set position in viewport. And then we can hook this up. So the target, we want to leave it as self, but the position we want to set based on some values they pass in. So I'm going to drag this position over here to add an input pin. And then I'm going to actually hold down Alt and left click to unhook it because we want to slightly modify it. So this is going to be the position of the cursor if the mouse was at the top left corner of it. So we want to add half the width and the height to it so that it's centered. So we can right click on this and say split. And then we can say get brush. So we want to get the size of it. And then we can right click on this and say split. And so you can see now we have the size. And so we can take this and we want to divide it by 2 because, right, we want to go to the center. So we'll say float divide. And then inside of here, we want to put 2. And so what we want to do is we want to take this x and this y and we want to subtract half of it from that. So we can split this guy and then we can drag off of this and say float minus. And we want to drag in the x, and then I'm just going to copy and paste this node and do the same thing for the y. And then we can split this guy so we can easily set it, and then we just drag that there and drag that there, and there we go. So again, we will actually make use of this here in a little bit. I just wanted to write it right now so that way we didn't have to come back here later. And I believe that's all we need to do for this widget. So let's just file, save all, and then come back to our first person character. And then up in the event graph in the begin play, let's actually go ahead and create that cursor widget so that it displays on our screen. So we're going to right click and say create widget. And then we can drag this in here. So the widget we want to create obviously is our cursor widget. So select that. And then for the owning player, we want to right click and say get controller. And so this is going to return to us a controller, but this wants a player controller. So we're going to cast to player controller. And then since I know it's going to succeed, I'm just going to right click and say convert to pure cast. And then we're actually going to be doing this a few times here. So I'm just going to collapse these nodes into a handy little function because again, we're going to be doing this a couple times. So I'm just going to right click on both of these nodes and say collapse to function. And then I'm just going to call it get player controller. And then let's go inside of here real quick and make sure it's set up correctly. So we basically just want to drag off of this guy and drag it onto here, and that will add a result node like so. And then we can plug this in like that. And then I'm just going to call this player controller. And then since this isn't modifying anything about our blueprint or about our class, we're going to select const. And then we're also going to make it pure so that it doesn't have the execution pins. And then we can compile and save that. And then also while we're here, since we are good programmers, let's start adding things to categories because we're going to need these later just to keep things separated a little bit. So this one, I'm just going to add all the variables and all the functions that we create into a Deadzone aiming category. So that way you guys can easily look back later and see which functions and stuff were part of this tutorial. So let's just say Deadzone aiming. And then let's also make this private because nobody else needs access to it. And you can see it added it over here. All right. So now that we have this function written nice and clean, we can come back here and simply just drag this into here. And so that will create our widget. And so the next thing I want to do is just save a reference to it so that we can modify it later. And then we want to add it to the viewport. So I'm going to right click on this and say promote to variable. And that will create a variable for us. And so I'm going to rename this to our cursor widget. And then just like we did for this function, let's add this to a category called Deadzone aiming. So we'll call like category Deadzone aiming. And then also we will make this private so that it cannot be accessed from outside of this blueprint. And then finally, we want to add it to the viewport. So we'll drag off of this and say add to viewport. And there we go. So now if we run this, we should be able to see that cursor on the screen. So if I press play, oh, it's a little big. What did we do wrong? Let me double check my cursor widget. All right, because we're not actually setting it. We need to actually set it. So we haven't done that yet. So if we go back to our first person character and we go down to the bottom here, let's actually create our event tick. So we need to do this in event tick because obviously the cursor could move at any given frame. So we need to constantly be updating the position of the cursor. So we're actually going to change this later, but for right now, just to show you guys that it's working, we can drag in our cursor widget, and we can call our set position and viewport centered function that we just wrote. And then we just want to put it in the center of the viewport for right now. So we can say get viewport size, and then we want to divide this by 2. So float divide, and then we'll put 2 here, and then we'll hook that up. Then we compile and save and run this. You can see the little cursor that we created just shows up in the middle of the screen. But now it's using our custom widget, so we can actually use this function to change where it shows up based on where you move the mouse. All right, so this is a good place to end this part 1 and then go on to part 2. So I'll see you guys in part 2.